Thank you, Charlene. That was deeply moved myself, and I think we all were. And it's a hard act to follow. Given that a certain Chinese-American law professor has recently had the sales of her book skyrocket due to a particular Wall Street Journal piece, I thought that I might also help promote the sales of Mirrored Reflections. So I've decided to entitle my response, Why Asian American Christian Women Are Superior. Young, Debbie, Chloe, and the rest of you, get your bags packed. You'll be on NPR, CNN, so forth, nationwide book tour coming. Both Mirrored Reflections and Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother possess elements of memoir, and both speak of the experience of Asian American women. But there really the comparisons end. While Chua displays quite an ignorance of ethnic and racial issues, the authors of Mirrored Reflections engage the text of Scripture as well as their social cultural context with a deftness, a thoughtfulness, and a maturity that is rare these days. So, why are Asian American women superior? And you can tweet that, okay? I think this is being tweeted here. And note by this rhetoric, I intend to highlight the contributions of this work. So I intend to highlight 4. 1, Asian American Christian women are superior because they model the strengths of collaborative work. They offer us the best of a unity amidst diversity. I've read enough books now to be able to tell what is and what isn't a rush job. Such is not the case of Mirrored Reflections. It has a surprising level of cohesiveness for an edited volume that is difficult to accomplish. I understand that the authors were not merely committed to writing an individual article, but rather committed to the overall project. And the quality of the finished project shows. The strength of a multi-author work is that there is a diversity not only in the approaches to scriptures, but to the personal narratives. And this is important because there is a plurality in what it means to be Asian American and what it means to be a woman. No prototypical Asian American woman exists. And while respecting diversity, the book does highlight some unifying features of the Asian American female experience. Through probing a particular trajectory in the biblical narrative, there is a movement from silence and marginalization in the early chapters to one of partnership, mutuality, and dialogue by its end. Now, if some of you dismiss these comments as merely touchy-feely, oh, isn't it sweet that they can work together, I would say that academics and pastors need to take heed here of their example. I've read some poorly written multi-author works, both at a popular level and for an academic audience. I'm currently working on a commentary with a colleague of mine for the Two Horizons series, and it's a series in which they partner a biblical scholar with a theologian. And so far the volumes in this series have had mixed success because it's hard to work together. So, personally, I would hope that I might be able to strive toward collaborative work to the example set forth by the authors of Mirrored Reflections. 2, Asian American Christian women are superior because they can uniquely hear texts that speak to issues of justice, particularly the abuse of power. The other night, my wife and I had a conversation about who she really is. She had just taken one of these, it was, I think, a Simmons personal EQ survey from a friend who's a consultant on these matters, and she came home wanting to discuss some of the results, and so she asked me, who am I, right? And how am I supposed to answer that? And one thing I said was that she's intuitive. Now, I quickly added this, that it's possible that's an innate quality of who she really is, but more likely it's a learned skill due to her being an Asian American woman who has to continually navigate social situations in which she was granted less respect because of her gender, race, and her small stature. I suspect males in general are less intuitive because we simply don't need to be. We are given the privilege to speak our minds without having to fear any negative repercussions of some of the dumb things that come out of our minds. Because of their social status, Asian American women are more attuned to the voices of Scripture that speak to matters of injustice and abuse and can uniquely speak into the church and the world on this topic. This comes loud and clear. The essays on Esther and Vashti, Bathsheba, Ruth, and Hannah, there is an incredible thoughtfulness to the reading of these texts displayed by these authors. And the essay on Elizabeth and Mary goes on even to explore the competition for recognition between women. In addition, Asian American women can teach us how to be a leader and a person of influence when you are on the margins. And this happens to all of us, both men and women. For the youth pastor in this room, who's serving under a dictatorial pastor, you need to read this book. Right? You know that you have to serve under perhaps an abusive structure, an abusive authoritative person. And these women have continually had to navigate these situations. We have a ton to learn from them. For the senior pastor out there who has to engage perhaps a stubborn board member or a stubborn elder board, this book is for you. Right? As Debbie's essay on Ruth reminds us, we have multivocal identities. So even for me, in one moment, I wield the power as I distribute grades among my students. And in another moment, I'm at the mercy of my senior colleagues as they review my tenure file. We move through these situations throughout life. And these women have an incredible experience and wisdom for that. These essays highlight the reality of these disparities of power and provide insight how to act wisely in the midst of them. The fool only knows revolution, coercion, or abdication. Wisdom is to rightly use the means at your disposal to advance the kingdom of Christ. And thank you for that. These essays help us in that regard. Not only do they identify the misuse of power in the biblical narratives, but they also highlight positive models of leadership. Young identifies Mordecai as a mentor for Esther. Melanie describes the depth and power of mutuality, the yin and the yang, of the partnership of Priscilla and Aquila in ministry, and her own journey in the ministry with her husband, Bruce. We ought to resist simplistic reifications of race and culture that have been the means of oppression. And by the way, this is my primary criticism of Amy Chua. Chinese women are not all this. Vietnamese women are not all that. Asian women are not naturally quiet and therefore unable to lead and teach. As Chloe's essay demonstrates, both women in the Bible and Asian American women today can move from silence to voice. They can progress from victim to leader. The problem today is not that Asian American women do not possess the capacity to lead. The problem today is that Asian American women are not given the opportunity to lead. 3. Asian American Christian women are superior because they enrich the depth and breadth of biblical interpretation for the church and the academy. As one who avowedly is interested in the project of Asian American theology or Asian American biblical interpretation, the question I oftentimes get is this: so what exactly is Asian American theology, or what exactly is Asian American biblical interpretation? And my initial response is simply by asking, well, what's white theology? What exactly is a black theology? Essentialize it for me. What exactly is a Latino or Latina theology? And if you think it's just liberation theology, you're reading too narrowly. Second, I respond, so what exactly does it mean to be Asian American? And my guess is that our answers to that question will be varied. There will be a great deal of complexity and nuance about our responses, but nevertheless, we may be able to describe a few clusters or descriptors that would describe this reality, and perhaps we may be able to form a typology. And so even, Chua's book, there is something that has sort of resonated with folks, that there is something that we can recognize to her claims. Typologies provide patterns, a set of associations that collectively describes patterns of being. So are Asian Americans similar to Hispanics? Yes, but in other ways, no. The role, for example, the role of education traditionally held by these groups, perhaps are viewed differently. In this regard, we may be similar to Jews, right? But we're different to them in different ways. And so this question that I always get, what exactly is? I suspect that it's coming from a desire from the dominant culture. And I will eschew essentialist constructions of my culture because I don't need to legitimate myself to the dominant culture. When I ask my white students to describe their culture, oftentimes they're unable to do so. Right? Now, is it because they lack a culture? No. But it's because they've never had to justify their behavior to others. And so I suspect that these questions, what exactly is Asian American theology? What exactly is Asian American biblical interpretation? It's rooted in modernist obsessions with methodology, epistemology, or objectivity, or a desire to be affirmed by the dominant culture. And I want us, and we spoke here about being able to name, put a name for ourselves. And I don't want to do this because someone's demanding that from me. Asian American biblical interpretation ought to be about engaging in constructive, contextual theology for the service of the church. So yesterday, in response to one of the problem of historical amnesia in Asian American churches, Grace suggested that maybe we need to do something different in our Wednesday night Bible studies. Maybe we need to do something different than Bible study. I'm good with that, okay? Or might I suggest that maybe we need to do Bible study differently? Currently, I'm teaching a course on Israelite prophets. And I plan to do a couple days on exile. Now, exile has gotten a lot of attention and traction in the academy recently, particularly through examining the biblical narratives through the emerging disciplines of forced migration studies and refugee studies. So, for example, people are studying the Babylonian exile, comparing the sociological and historical data of the Japanese internment camps, and just trying to get into the biblical narratives through these means. The Lord has granted me a gift this quarter, a Cambodian student. He is an older man who survived the killing fields of the Khmer Rouge. His story is compelling and heartbreaking. It is one of utter tragedy, yet some hope. He's a Christian man. When the soldiers suddenly descended upon his village, he was separated from his mother and father and 10 siblings. He lived for years in refugee camps, not knowing whether his family members were alive. Later on, he was reunited with his sister in the U.S., a sister he thought was dead. He had the opportunity to travel back to his homeland, only to find the records that his father had been killed by the Khmer Rouge. I asked Sumari if he might be willing to share his story with the class. And I do so, not as some, this is my Asian American history moment, but to help us read the biblical text on the Israelite exile and the Babylonian captivity. This is but one example of what I would say is Asian American biblical interpretation. Mirrored Reflections offers us a different kind of contribution. Neither claim to be the sole representatives of Asian American biblical interpretation. Yet in both cases, we are consciously engaging our context through and with the biblical text. So I appreciate the authors of Mirrored Reflections for contributing to this field. We have been deepened, broadened, and enriched by the discourse for the benefit of us all. Lastly, Asian American Christian women are superior because they broaden and deepen the voice of feminism. An additional question posed in this session is, how would the Academy benefit from understanding Asian American women's interpretation or perspective? And here I would say the Academy desperately needs more voices of women who are evangelical and of color. Steve Fowl, a New Testament scholar at Loyola in Maryland, came and spoke at SPU recently. He made a keen observation that unfortunately, ecclesial discourse has been co-opted by political discourse. We speak of being a Christian conservative or liberal, traditional or progressive. Yet political discourse is largely unhelpful in ecclesial and theological matters. Theological conservatism does not equate political conservatism. Unfortunately, it does oftentimes. And theological liberalism does not equate political liberalism. Just because someone is for, say, women's ordination does not mean he's necessarily for universal health care. Feminism and evangelical are not antithetical. Feminists ought not to be synonymous with liberal. Yet, unfortunately today, to be pro-woman is to be perceived as anti-orthodoxy or anti-evangelical. Or to be pro-woman is to be viewed as theologically suspect. Look, Jesus was pro-woman, okay? The gospel is pro-woman. Let's keep our discourse by the means of which we have in the church, of theology and in the church. What we need are more voices to expand and deepen the discourse on gender. More evangelical and non-white women voices need to be at the table in the academy and help reconstitute what it means to be feminists. What is amazing for me is that the authors of this book, the women here in this room, they're still at the table. Understand this, there are many a woman who've walked away from the church. And in one sense, they have a right to. Right? The story Chloe shares earlier today. I wouldn't be surprised if she just left that church and left Christianity altogether from her experience. I wouldn't be able to fault her for that. So there are many a woman, because of their marginalization, who've left the church. There are a lot of feminists who've given up on evangelical. And it's amazing that these women here are staying put, even within the very institutions that oppress them and marginalize them. These women are to be commended today because they still believe in the church and their ethnic communities. And we are all better off because of this willingness to engage and partner. Thank you.